Everything you have been taught about forgiveness is a carefully constructed lie, and the people who taught it to you were either too afraid to tell you the truth or were directly benefiting from your compliance. Society has spent decades conditioning you to believe that releasing every wound, excusing every violation, and extending endless grace to every person who has carved pieces out of you is somehow the highest expression of your character. But the ancient minds who actually understood human nature, the philosophers who built empires, and survived the brutal arithmetic of power, they knew something that modern psychology is too commercially incentivized to admit. There exist specific categories of betrayal so architecturally destructive that forgiving them does not heal you at all. It simply hands the person who wounded you a more sophisticated map of exactly where to strike next. Once you understand the mechanics of these three betrayals with genuine clarity, you will never again confuse your tolerance for virtue or your suffering for strength. The first betrayal that demands not your forgiveness, but your complete cold removal, is what can only be described as the calculated extraction. And the critical distinction you must burn into your understanding is the difference between a mistake and a maneuver. A mistake is a product of impulse, confusion, or momentary failure of judgment. But a maneuver requires architecture. It requires planning. It requires deliberate construction of deception across days and weeks, and sometimes years. It requires someone to sit in the quiet theater of their own mind and run a full simulation of your pain, to model your devastation with precision, and then to decide with cold internal clarity that your suffering is an acceptable operating cost. And then, having made that decision, to proceed to look you directly in your eyes, across dinner tables, and in morning conversations while internally maintaining the entire scaffolding of their deception without flinching. What Seneca understood when he wrote to Lucilius about the absolute necessity of judging a person deeply before granting them access to your inner world is that trust is not an emotional experience, but a structural one. Trust is the load-bearing spine of any genuine human connection, the architecture that holds the weight of shared life, shared vulnerability, and shared investment in each other's well-being. A calculated betrayal does not compress that spine under weight. It does not bend it or strain it. It severs the spinal cord, and there is a difference between damage that can heal and damage that cannot. No amount of tears, no quality of apology, no sincerity of remorse, however genuine it may appear, can surgically reattach what was deliberately and methodically cut by someone operating with full awareness of what they were doing. When you uncover the logistics of someone's betrayal and you find the dates, the lies, the narrative management, the deliberate emotional performance designed to keep you calm while they completed their operation, you are not looking at a person who lost control. You are looking at a person who revealed their fundamental classification of you, which is not as a human being with an interior life worthy of protection, but as a resource to be optimized, a utility to be used until something more valuable becomes available. Erich Fromm dissected this exact dynamic in his work on human connection, separating authentic love from transactional attachment, and his conclusion was that genuine connection requires the absolute recognition of the other person's full reality and humanity. Transactional attachment, by contrast, views the other person as a dispenser, a source of comfort or money or validation or stability, something to be extracted from, rather than someone to be genuinely known. When a person executes a calculated betrayal, they are not revealing a moment of weakness. They are revealing the entire architecture of how they have always privately categorized you, and that revelation cannot be unfiled once you have seen it. When you forgive that, when you absorb it and rebuild on top of it, you are not demonstrating love or maturity or spiritual evolution. You are demonstrating to the predator that their cost-benefit analysis was accurate. You are confirming that you are a renewable source of supply with a tolerance for exploitation. That makes continued extraction not just possible, but entirely rational from their perspective. Your brain, in the immediate aftermath of discovering a calculated betrayal, will manufacture a story about regaining control through forgiveness. It will tell you that if your love is strong enough to absorb this blow, you somehow win. This is one of the most dangerous lies your own mind will ever tell you, because it reframes your continued availability to the predator as a form of power when it is in fact the most complete form of surrender. Marcus Aurelius, surrounded by men who would have traded his life for a political appointment without a moment of hesitation, did not respond to betrayal with emotional devastation or with revenge. He understood that revenge is an emotion, and emotions are leverage for the enemy, that the moment you perform your pain, you hand the person who caused it a confirmation that their actions had the desired effect and a blueprint for causing it again. He responded instead with cold, data-driven removal. He looked at the evidence, acknowledged the nature of the organism in front of him, adjusted his proximity accordingly, and moved forward without drama, without extended explanation, and without apology for his own clarity. The second betrayal reaches deeper than the first and is in many ways more catastrophic because it does not steal your resources or your trust. It attempts to steal your reality itself. It is the systematic and deliberate distortion of your perception, the quiet, persistent campaign to make you doubt your own memory, your own judgment, your own grip on what actually happened and what is actually true. What makes it so surgically effective is that it exploits the very empathy and desire for harmony that make you a person worth knowing. In the first place, turning your best qualities into the entry points for your own psychological dismantling. When you confront the evidence of a violation, and they respond not with accountability, but with a calm and authoritative counterattack on your competence, you are watching something precise and deliberate unfold in real time. They tell you that you are misremembering, that you are too sensitive, that you are constructing a crisis out of nothing, and they do this with such steady certainty that you begin to question whether the evidence in your own hands is actually evidence at all. You begin to run calculations on your own perception, to interrogate your own memory, to wonder whether the problem is not what they did, but the way your particular psychology processes ordinary events as catastrophic ones. And this is the moment the betrayal completes itself, not when they lied, not when they violated you, but when you first began to audit your own sanity on their behalf, rather than holding them to account for their behavior. Epictetus, who had his leg deliberately broken by his master, and who walked with a permanent limp for the remainder of his life as a living monument to what one human being is capable of doing to another, understood something essential about what actually constitutes a person's most vital possession. He argued with absolute conviction that the body's destruction is survivable, that physical suffering, however severe, does not reach the deepest part of a human being, but that the destruction of the hegemonicon, the ruling center, the faculty by which you observe reality and form accurate judgment, that destruction is total. A person who has lost the use of their legs can still reason with perfect clarity, can still observe the world accurately, can still form genuine judgment, can live with full interior sovereignty. But a person who has lost confidence in their own perception has no independent axis of existence. They must outsource their sense of reality to the very person who corrupted it, creating a dependency more complete and more insidious than any physical captivity could ever be. Dr. Jennifer Freyd's research into betrayal trauma illuminates the biological mechanics of why the betrayal of reality works with such devastating effectiveness on intelligent, empathetic people. When the source of your violation is simultaneously the source of your psychological safety, your brain faces an impossible conflict between acknowledging the truth and maintaining the attachment it has calculated it cannot survive losing. So it initiates what Freyd calls betrayal blindness, a kind of voluntary perceptual shutdown where the mind minimizes, forgets, reframes, or simply accepts the abuser's version of events, not because you are weak or foolish, but because your nervous system has made a tragic survival calculation. It has determined that the pain of full awareness is more dangerous in the immediate term than the comfort of the lie. That maintaining the attachment is worth the cost of surrendering your grip on what actually happened. And this is not forgiveness. It is not patience. It is not the spiritual maturity of someone who has chosen peace over conflict. It is the slow surrender of your most fundamental human faculty to someone who is actively mining it for leverage. This is why when you encounter this betrayal, you must not argue with them, because arguing implies that their words still carry weight. In your reality, that their version of events is still a legitimate competitor to your own direct experience. You must not explain your perspective at length or in detail, because explaining is a plea to be understood by someone who has demonstrated they are actively and strategically committed to misunderstanding you as a mechanism of control. You must simply anchor yourself to the objective facts with the flat, unshakable certainty of a person who has seen the mechanism behind the illusion, who has watched the magician's hands and knows exactly where the coin went. And then you must remove yourself entirely and without ceremony, not as punishment, not as performance, but as the most essential act of psychological quarantine you will ever perform on your own behalf. The third and most lethal betrayal does not announce itself with violation or distortion. It does not arrive with the shock of discovery or the cold clarity of evidence laid out in front of you. It arrives disguised as love. It wears the face of concern and familiarity and shared history, and it is precisely this disguise, the fact that it comes from someone you have every reason to trust completely, that makes it capable of a destruction the other two betrayals cannot accomplish. Because what it targets is not your wealth or your sanity, but your becoming. It is the sustained and systematic sabotage of your evolution by the people who are most threatened by it. It operates through guilt and nostalgia and subtle, relentless erosion, through the comments that are engineered to present themselves as care while functioning as compression, designed to keep you smaller than you are capable of being. It operates through the conflicts that materialize with suspicious precision exactly when you are on the verge of something important, the arguments that erupt the night before your most significant opportunity, the crisis, that demand your full emotional attention at the exact moment your focus is most needed elsewhere. It operates through the slow atmospheric pressure of a relationship that requires you to remain exactly who you were years ago in order for the other person to remain comfortable with who they are, their stagnation requiring your stagnation as its justification. Erich Fromm identified what he called the symbiotic union as the perfect structure for this dynamic and the distinction he drew between healthy connection and parasitic attachment is one of the most practically important insights in the literature of human psychology. In a genuine mature connection, two people maintain their individual gravity and stand beside each other as complete autonomous beings, supporting each other's growth because they are not threatened by it, because their own sense of self does not depend on the other person remaining unchanged. In the parasitic attachment, one organism cannot tolerate the growth of the other because that growth creates independence, creates armor, creates a version of the host that no longer requires the parasite's presence or validation to feel whole. The parasite does not need you strong. It needs you accessible. It needs you insecure. It needs you to believe that your value is conditional on remaining in the configuration in which it first found you. So it does not attack your growth with weapons or with obvious hostility, because obvious hostility could be identified and resisted. It attacks with whispers, with "you have changed," with "I miss the old you," with "why are you acting like you are better than everyone else now?" It plants seeds of doubt about your intelligence, your judgment, your capability, your right to want more than what you currently have. And it does this with the perfect cover story of concern, framing every act of sabotage as an act of care. And if you forgive this, if you decide in the privacy of your own heart that their comfort is worth more than your potential, you are not being gracious or patient or loving in any meaningful sense of that word. You are agreeing to your own erasure. You are signing a contract that trades your destiny for the temporary emotional stability of someone who has decided that your growth is a threat to their identity. You are choosing the warmth of a familiar compression over the cold altitude of the person you were genuinely built to become. And that choice will compound across years and decades into a life that feels like a haunting, a persistent awareness of the distance between who you are and who you could have been. Epictetus was ruthless on this specific point because he had lived the full spectrum of human suffering and had arrived at conclusions about human nature that were not comfortable but were absolutely accurate. He understood that elevation is inherently a departure, that the process of becoming more requires the willingness to leave behind configurations that no longer fit, including relationships that were built around a version of you that no longer exists. He understood that the people who refuse to climb will always experience the climber's ascent as an act of abandonment or arrogance, and that their pain is real, but it is not your responsibility to resolve it by descending. You cannot negotiate with this dynamic. You cannot find the therapeutic conversation that will make someone comfortable with your growth when their entire sense of stability is built on your remaining small. You can only make the decision clear and final, and without extended apology, that your destiny is not available for auction. Cut the rope with the clean, decisive motion of someone who has understood the situation completely, and let them keep their comfort while you keep your trajectory. What binds all three of these betrayals together is a single common thread, which is that forgiving them does not make you more evolved, or more spiritually advanced, or more capable of love. It makes you more available for repeated destruction by people who have already demonstrated in the clearest possible terms that they will use that availability without hesitation or remorse. The myth of unconditional forgiveness that society has spent generations weaponizing against people like you is not a spiritual principle derived from genuine wisdom about human flourishing. It is a mechanism of social control, a way of prioritizing the surface appearance of harmony over the structural reality of justice, a way of keeping the people who benefit from your compliance in a permanent position of benefit. It is easier for your family to tell you to simply forgive someone who destroyed your financial life than it is for them to hold that person accountable, because accountability creates conflict, and conflict disrupts the social comfort of everyone in proximity to it. It is easier for the culture to broadcast "let it go" than it is to teach people how to stand their ground with cold, patient, unshakable clarity, because people who know how to stand their ground are significantly harder to manage and manipulate. So understand, finally, and with the kind of clarity that does not fade, the precise difference between releasing anger and granting access, because these are not the same action, and conflating them is one of the most costly errors you can make. You absolutely must release the anger. Anger held inside the body is a coal that burns the hand holding it, not the person it was intended for, and Marcus Aurelius was unambiguous about the self-destructive nature of carrying rage. The best revenge, he wrote, is to be unlike the person who caused the injury, to refuse to let their worst qualities colonize your own character. But releasing anger has nothing to do with reopening the door, restoring trust, or returning to the prior configuration of a relationship. You can understand with complete intellectual clarity why a venomous creature behaves the way it does. You can release every ounce of bitterness and still refuse, with absolute cold and permanent clarity, to let it back into your house, to give it renewed access to your life. When you hold that line, when you refuse to restore trust to someone who demonstrated they will spend it without conscience, you are not holding a grudge. You are holding a standard. You are making a declaration to yourself and to the universe that your psychological integrity has a value. And the people who call that coldness, who call it an inability to love, are almost always the people who have the most to lose. The predator always accuses the prey of cruelty the moment the prey develops the clarity and the backbone to simply step out of the trap. Think with complete honesty about the person you have forgiven the most in your life, the one whose behavior you have explained and contextualized. Did your endless forgiveness produce growth in them? Did it move them toward greater integrity? Or did it simply function as a recurring demonstration? You already know the answer. The gap between what you know and what you have been willing to act on is where your destruction occurs. The Stoic response is not grief or rage. It is the clean, cold, efficient response of someone who has looked at the data and made the only logical adjustment. You transition from the person waiting for the betrayer to change to the state of the architect who has redesigned the structure to exclude the element. You apply what the Stoics called apatheia, the disciplined eradication of irrational emotional turbulence, the cultivation of a state of core functioning. Observe behavior the way a scientist observes a reaction. Subject has demonstrated pattern of deception. Logical response is removal. Executed. If they are embedded in your family, you become impossibly busy. You strip all warmth and vulnerability and become what they call a gray rock. They will build narratives about your cruelty and coldness. You must not defend yourself, because that requires engaging with their version of reality. If you judge their smear campaign as the mechanically repetitive behavior of an exposed manipulator, you will feel something closer to a mild pity. The era of apologizing to the people who are holding the knife is over. What remains is the architecture of a life built by someone who finally decided they were worth protecting.